I've been thinking a lot in the last few years about how the world's changing, how there are pressures to, with borders going up, where we're talking far more about boundaries. And I've been thinking a lot about questions of belonging and who we allow to belong. What I'm going to do today is actually, for me, a little bit scary. I'm going to read you some, for me, very new poems, some of which directly come out of a response to the COVID and the pandemic and those restrictions, because I really wanted to respond to the theme of in our time. My first poem is called Sitherism. A woman walks into a city. There's a forest of tall lights, concrete, high-rise, cast shadows, flecks the horizon. A woman walks into a city. There's a field of tarmac, cars careen, windblown, traffic annoyances. It always happens. Street and lamp are intimate. We could talk of crowds, not of lawn, of congestion, or of overgrown grass. A woman walks into a city. There's an allotment of people, uprooted, torn weeds, split seeds, roadside tatters, with lights far from windows. A woman walks into a city. There's one tree of shattered blossom, nubs of new. She falls to her knees. Witness how they bear the weight. Every branch is a script of bone grip on the earth. Leaves spell the distances, slivers of hearts. Tulips. Here are the parks, open to all, where they cherish those companions, flowers, if not all children, where I thought it would be different, trusting people to be kind, where 54% are more likely to be fined. We're breaking, where silence grows, stems harden, split. 1,741 deaths in custody. Bulbs are broken, always in this country, and diagnosed, disordered, plants breaking, colour-streaked, die, after being spat on, newsprints fragile. Petals blow apart, bleed underfoot. We are not the virus, the flowers dead in the earth. Bodies more than weeds. I cannot breathe. The next poem I'm going to read was actually commissioned by the Hayward Gallery for their Among the Trees exhibition, which opened just before lockdown in London, which was very sad and feels very much of our time. It's an ekphrastic poem, and it responds to two gorgeous artworks by the indigenous Colombian painter, Abel Rodriguez. And if you're from Colombia, I apologize. My pronunciation's not great. He's from an indigenous community in the Amazonian region, and his artwork represents and recreates the ecology that he grew up with, and also climate change. And I found it incredibly powerful and really moving. And if you have the opportunity, do go and have a look at his artworks. I believe they are exhibited quite widely. When we consider everything that grew, the highest and the lowest trees were the houses of gods. Above us danced the Tanaga and the Tinamu, the Tinarinet and the Trogan. Their feathers flashed bright blessings as each bird flew, spreading seeds to sprout green everywhere under our feet. There was no silence. Tongues of leaves unfurled, songs to which lianas wound in counterpoint. epiphytes harmonized longing with orchids. With their bark breaths, trees chanted the names of us, full of passion flowers and ferns. Fronds were hymns to our community. Sky drew our trees close enough to touch. Seba placed arms tenderly around our mothers. Our fathers rested without any fear, a brittleness in their broad branches. Jaguar purred, stretched out on boughs. Poodoo and tamadu foraged among foliage. We all thrived. In season there was always fruit. Soursop and maypop dropped into our hands. Along the banks, water overlapped. The fish and snake communed quietly. Quindío palms grew fat with rains, thrust supple and tangled roots into soil. The logger's axe made ghosts of us. Our thoughts split like stems. We heard nothing as articulate as wind in the wet canopy. No trees to buttress us, our steps as spores dispersed. Our lips crack from asking why. These edgelands are twigs, dust and dust. It smothers us, stings skin and eyes. It is evergreen only in memories. So far from our trees, we know constant pain. We who are never to return. How can we remember who we are? Dabs and dots, a few faded colors. It feels like the climate is changing all the time. And I know this has been a year of a huge number of storms. And there was a point last year, I remember a day going out and it just felt like it rained and rained and rained. And this poem is in response to that. This morning, rain lashes down, sluices off roofs, spouts over streets. Crowds hurry under umbrellas, huddle or stop, soggy in the entrances to shops. Despite floodlamps, weather halts play. The gutters overspill and gushing puddle. The gutters overspill and gushing puddles sweep pavements. This morning, runnels fill with mud and leaves. Canals gargle, rubbish open-mouthed. Swirling water overtakes cars, submerges bus bonnets, white vans, breaches high embankments. This morning, the city's arteries are slick, funneling fatbergs to the estuary. New tributaries surge and spate. Water makes over the solid world for otters, octopus, and silver eels. Giant kelp reforests the strand. This morning, there's no difference between grey sky and the waves. Sunshine is sucked through. If there's no way back, hope is feathers, scattered green pods, a soaked silence. My next poem is really a lockdown poem. I've been to a lot of readings and people keep saying that, and so I'm sorry if you've heard a lot of lockdown poems. It's very much out of the first lockdown in London, where we had very limited opportunities to go walking. I look out of the window and instead of walking, measure distance, plot a trajectory, and choose the safe, expedient path. What will I regret today? Eye contact, because every one is full of calculations, considering contagions, tracing apps, sniffing somebody back to some place. Where am I supposed to be from? The skyline sneers, shouting in my face. Outside the empty station, I see cracks. By my feet, the dandelions break through tarmac. Aftermath and yellow weeds, blooms fed by piss. Heads blown apart, boom, and my heart, seeds scudding past. We remember when blood and love were just one. Then the morning, our bodies reached half states, needling, never ceasing, and how people looked before the masks, heads turned, eyes slitted, when we washed our hands, singing happy birthday. We remembered everything that was just after the first outbreak of sleeping disease among the Alsatian, when we did what you did else, but it was never good enough. We were brushed past as if we'd shared 500 dirty lovers, not saying their names. We remember after the graffiti on shop windows, takeaways, more than 260 hate crimes recorded in the first 3 months. We tried to reframe what happened, hung a mirror on the wall to reflect the threat of arms not pulling us up. How we used 65 grams of our blood as a replacement for 1 egg. We'll still die somewhere. We feel the sun is the only thing just. 2. How the trees were rooted, and we spoke nothing, barely, yes. Trees were born of peace, Xiao Kang, the months, that abundance, taking a long time, days to sprout slow from soil. And it was vital to breathe and keep breathing, strong and strange, until it felt like we might break, drift off, and float as leaves, gathering in mounds at night, not saying anything about that. Sap couldn't clot, and we were within microns of the perfect distance from each other. Sky 10 coughs above, and the wind 2 meters away. Squirrels outside seem to stand and say, life is a simple matter, more or less to lick a tree until a tongue is sad. And after that rather gloomy poem, perhaps, I want to finish with something that feels more hopeful. In London, there's a museum of gardening. And what I learnt when I went there, the thing that stayed with me, was that after the Second World War, there was a boom in horticultural clubs. And there's something about that, planting something new, about hope, that really resonated, and I hope speaks as well to our time. The poem's called The Conservator. The bomb and what happened after. Charlock and clover grew after. Among the rubble, she picked after glister. Bellis perennis persisted after. War opened spaces. Lucerne came after, and fireweed flamed unbroken. Wild flowers were hopes after. She compressed those after and between flimsy sheets. After the blast, she pressed leaves after leaves, petals into an ever after of absorbent blotters. She lived to preserve. She was feeling after something. Nothing was white after. She stored specimens after drying. Foliage labeled after a taxonomy of loss. And after that, she put seeds in packets. Thank you very much.
Well, we'll start with the collaboration. I'll say a couple of words about it and then Alvin can add. whatever he likes to it. I was approached, I don't know how long ago, several months ago, by Anthony Kaleshu to ask if I would like to collaborate with another poet. Poems on the subject of COVID, of course. I mean, what else can we write about? What else can we think about? It's quite difficult. So it was wonderful to be able to choose Alvin, who I've known as a person and whose poems I've long admired. So basically what we did, we wrote one poem each, and what we shall read is a small section, a 4-page section of really still an ongoing collaboration. Alvin?
Yeah. So we've been wanting to collaborate for ages, and we've been writing to each other on and off over the years, over email, over Messenger, and so on and so forth. So having a solid project to sort of chew on was great. I think what we ended up doing was use the poems as a form of epistolary mode, right? That we were essentially giving each other updates on our relative situations in COVID. And, so instead of letters, we were writing poems, but very much speaking from where we were. So George, obviously in the UK, me in Singapore, pushing against what was happening in the news all around us, and our own place in it, right? How we were dealing with the circumstances around us. And then the writing very quickly, as all good writing does, started finding its own way to say what it wants to say and sort of pretty much getting out of hand. That's I think, part of the fun of this sort of thing, which is why we want to continue. Hopefully get a year's worth or more of writing out of it, and possibly a book to come. What we've got today for you, I think, is a 4-page segment that will be, I think, published, George, in the anthology that he's talking about. What's it called, the anthology, George?
I've completely forgotten. I know.
Wanted to plug it.
By Anthony Kaleshu, and it's being done for, I've forgotten everything about it, except the poems, Alvin.
Well, that's all we have to share, just the poems. So maybe we should just go ahead and do that.
So I'll start, and then we'll just sort it out. Okay.
Yeah.
So here we go. The poem is called Past Time. We sigh the word again, as if it were a new thing, like rediscovering rain, an endless reckoning with our sense of ending. We are waiting for the train to arrive before it has left. We're singing the refrain while music comes adrift and trains refuse to shift. We think to breathe and weigh the sunlight as it falls on grass swept through the day by wind, like distant bells or anything that tolls. Dear friend, the words between the silence rearrange the various shades of green, though nothing seems to change. So even grass is strange.
Nothing seems to change, and nothing seems to move. The heart ebbs out of range. It craves a sea to love, but all there is groove and tolerable drain and mud raked over coals for heat. But still we strain to sing, to brave the shoals. The minutes claim their tolls, the hours pay their keep. The tables turn and plead for unreserved sleep. The still extracts a fee. Free time is never free. Old Leonard had it right, that everything is cracked. I had to slough my sight to gain this smarting fact. Each day I cannot act is one forfeit, astray, misspent, a page turned. But what is there to say with time? What earned, and to what blind end? This rhyme is delay.
We are only delaying autumn, not cancelling it. Autumn will not be postponed, or not for long. Leaves that are preparing to fall will reconsider their position and will make a statement in due course. Birds have continued to mate, and the rate of egg production has not fallen, nor have the leaves. Birds' wings continue to beat. The position with hearts is equally assuring. They too continue to beat and have not been cancelled, though some may experience an inevitable delay. This is the language, and these are the terms in which we negotiate delay and postponement. Be assured that nothing has been cancelled. Our punctuation is in place. Grammar is on our side. So now there is only autumn to prepare for.
I'm thinking how here we reckoned our days without the season's clock, pendulous fall, winter's white talk. I suppose what we do is carry on until caught invariably by surprise. May's loud heat, December's lush skies. Today, an unseasonable gloom has thrilled an afternoon. A year-end storm come much too soon. Heaven reduced to a waiting room, a Ragnarok thrum, the ball of a jet. It's August, but not September yet. The schoolward course is test-bound, rung-stepped, an almanac of hoops. The financial year, implacable, loops onto itself, finds us, but is never found wanting. Another while, another clinical scan, man hands worriment to man in a sealed, plain envelope. Dental visits, barber stops. We take circling as certainty of line, break as mark of headway, of hope that things pass, that passing might be possible, welcome, light, free.
What is it to come to an end? It is not this stream of words, but its arbitrary stops and hesitations. That could go on forever, or whatever forever means. There is no doubt that sentences exist and that lines end, because we make them end. Listen to the drip and drawl drudgery of it, the gripe and growl of it as it passes through time. The clothes on a line are in high spirits, like can-can dancers kicking up their legs. The clouds muse on them and withdraw into ever deeper recesses of contemplation. My tongue is sore with speaking. My throat is dry. I trudge through endless deserts of syntax to arrive at this wordless, deserted fort where some foreign legion briefly fetched up and entered memory through the back door of film. There was no dialogue then, only film waiting for a soundtrack, for its version of Cut Up, Time's own fan fiction, where we built a fort out of whatever it affords, its walls of syntax crumbling. We joked about it, admired its dry humor and its thirst for contemplation. We said we'd spend night there and then withdraw into a sense of the local on its own last legs. What are we then? Sentences or spirits? What happened to us? What drags us through time with its own limited versions of growl and gripe? Listen again. Do you hear it now? That drip, drip, drip of water seeking its own vessels and an end to waiting. There is no certainty without doubt, and doubt, no doubt, could carry on forever. Let's imagine here is where it stops, here, in mid-sentence, or a place like this.
Why do we sentence ourselves to this refusal of silence, these beats of idle fingers upon the wall of a page. I come back to this. Sometimes one world thins enough to hear another, the faintest echo of what might yet be or what perhaps is elsewhere. A life we can't touch, yet half remember, a second movement, a next, a continuing. An ear pressed against the shadows of cinemas and churches, asleep to its own slumber. Leave the boy be, muttering to unseen spirits, his black tousled hair graying in the skittish light, dreaming of waking, his palms clutching air as at a thread of a song leading him homeward. The music made in being, being with, knowing as a kind of end.
What news of the world? From my part of the country, the wind and the sea. And what news in yours? Just dark clouds, growing darker, and the sound of things falling. Falling far, as if forever, and time slowly retreating. Then there is still time. So that's the end of the collaborative sequence, or at least that section of it, which we've put forward for the anthology and for this occasion. Jenny, do we have a little bit of time for read 2 or 3 poems each?
Yeah.
Why don't you finish, Alvin, and I'll kick off and I'll pass it over to you. Should we do that?
Yeah.
Let's do that. Okay, here's a poem. It's in the form of a sonnet. I was on a train going up north somewhere, and a whole bunch of lads, and when I say lads, I mean lads with a capital L, got on and started drinking and talking. They were quite bright lads, but I thought this would probably not end well. So, delayed. They were going to the city, but the train was late. There would be problems. What to do now? To ring ahead and explain? But would the bar be open then or shut? Anxiety and anger led the drink. They had the beer, there was a natural thirst, and night was coming on. Too late to think of other trips, to see who'd come off worst. It's always late, moaned Duncan. Paul agreed. Then Mark piped up with a joke, and Martin swore. When it arrived, the train was at half speed, and there'd be no point in going anymore. The night weighed with them, heavy with its dirt. There would be trouble. Someone would get hurt. And I'll read you 2 or 3 tiny poems. These are 10-line poems. As with the collaboration with Alvin, I've been keeping it. It's a kind of diary in poetry form. They're all in the same form. They're just 10 lines. They're basically 3 haikus plus a single 5-syllable line. And well, here's a poem, one of those, called Red Cap. He was a power in the world, but the world had no more use for him. So the world swallows and excretes the bloated powers that seem to run it. He consoled himself with several rounds of golf and a new red cap like a spot of blood. This is the gifts. What do you find there? A cabinet of winter stuffed with pale storms, files of drafts and missing information, damp socks, gloves, hands like lost evenings. Who has put them there? Don't ask. It doesn't matter. Such gifts just appear and accumulate. I'll read you one last one and pass over to Alvin. This is another of the short ones. I have an uncle, Zoltan, who is over 300 years old. He's Central European. He has various castles or schlosses, and his universe continues whatever house happens in the world. He's Uncle Zoltan, and his Uncle Zoltan's plague times. My Uncle Zoltan had an eye for disasters. He'd watch them passing like a smear of crows cursing at the failing light. His Gothic nature sympathized with them, drunk on the melodrama. He was facetious. Sometimes he was right. Over to you.
Oh, I miss you, George. Do we have to wait for a plague to like catch up like this?
You must come here more often.
Yeah, I'll wear a mask. Okay, so I'll just read maybe three. The first two of them came from this collaboration. We picked for that four-page section something that was quite coherent, that had a sort of back and forth thread going on, because they seem to hang together for 4 pages. But some of the exchanges had their own sort of story going on. So I'll just read a little bit of that. And they come from the particular circumstances we are writing from. So this piece was written right about when, in the middle of, as if COVID weren't enough, the whole shootings in the US, which sparked the Black Lives Matters movement, all that sort of thing started happening, and all that pent-up energy of our society started to come to the fore. And it had, of course, resonances across the globe, including in Singapore. So this is a piece, part of the exchange, and it's called Night, I suppose. Oh, and I also wanted to say that you can't see it in the reading, but many of my segments of this collaboration play off George's sort of haiku-like structure and form. So I tried to write in a similar way, and then started to sort of break it a little bit, things like that. Is night kinder for waiting, is the question asked of this unquiet. Night as break, as pause, as reset, quelled restiveness, but we've had enough. Night is a mob of shadows gathered to protest daily profiling. All nights look the same to a blind policeman, black beneath day's tatters. Something to pass through without fanfare on the way to real business. Night has diurnal south, these unmapped, unmined hours not put to work yet. Lazy native time, dissembling illiterate, impenitent night. Night as a virus, keeping us from shops and school and constant increase. Do all nights matter? Some are just trouble, like this. Some are crucibles of an unspent heat. Some exhaust themselves to light, a white surrender. Another piece, it was written during the Hungry Ghost Month. Those of you who have some familiarity with East Asian culture would know that we have a month-long Halloween essentially, and it's called the 7th month, and this was written during the 7th month this year, which was around about August, September, can't remember. 7th month, in the 7th month, sprung from old bones and sky, a sun-graced sameness, bland enough for ghosts to come home, bearing hunger, bearing grudge and growl, and drawn to tanki tableaus, pyric flourish of paper gold, plied by perspiring progeny, wishing this stale year would end. Round and round the sandalwood again, ash the fragrance of ancestry aloft, suit-bound, hellward bearing akong ama ai atse, astride the etiolated tongues. Tuni bolai, tuni bonang lai pai pai. And 咁耐都冇人嚟燒香嘅 and walao risen every annum like the untrimmed grass to tax living memory and the piety of face. Not the second coming, but the 70th that drags, has the descendantry looking askance at the toll each breath pays to an omnipresent past that asks and does not answer. The last piece I'm going to read gives a little bit of context to the idea of spending time and wasting time and being past time that this year has represented for me. So I've been writing, and this went to my PhD and is ongoing, of course. I've been writing about losing my eyesight, which I'm slowly doing, essentially. And so every sort of year, every month, every hour I spend not doing something because I can't, not going places, not seeing the world as I enjoy doing. Every moment spent being held back from that feels like it's a year we're not going to get back. Of course, everyone feels that way, but it feels more urgent to me somehow because of my eye condition. What it is like to go blind slowly. Even black holes let glimmers out, like the ghosts of signal, fugacious, tubitable. They're calling a name at the nurse's station. Is it yours? That's just the brain dreaming it is whole. Sometimes the switches snap from use. Sometimes the damp gets in, or rats chew up the circuitry. And before you know it, you've gone and ruined someone's retirement. The stew a little less salty every time. Sea stinging a little less, becoming more horizontal, more cloud. I did not notice the edge of the glass. It was suddenly there, like bad news in the mail, like a phone call after midnight. A faint tea scent, like distant lips. The sun with a head cold come to collect. Not enough to take home in a bag, finish it here or get some help. Nobody is going to stop being happy just because you broke your eggs. It gets night earlier and stays there. Muffled laughter, but with photons. The pillowy underneaths of blankets. Tree bark scraped off so the sap dries out. Did you touch me? Or the feather of a claw? Speaking loudly or more slowly doesn't help, you know. Be thankful for the rest of the cutlery drawer, the stench of roses. Get your garden ready before the gate closes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alvin.
Gone away from me. I spent 25 years writing out of material conceived in it. But I was in London too, and in various other places in England. At the moment, local means extraordinary. Local, as you will know, Lisa, it means a room, it means a window with a tiny yard. And in that tiny yard, there are a couple of bird feeders to which come sparrows, blue tits, and the occasional blackbird. They too, things enter into one's poems, just like our current situation. You know, how can one not respond to it? How can it not soak the skin to some degree?
So everything George has said, and certainly place has been a very important part of my writing as someone from Singapore. I mean, one can't help it, right? It's flavored by place. And obviously today, given the current situation and travel lockdowns all around the world, certainly in a place like Singapore, which, you know, on one hand used to be one of the major travel hubs in the world, and now it's just completely shut down from that. The intense claustrophobia of that, being stuck in a tiny island that used to be, you know, a hub in the world for movement and you know, going places. And we're now very, very much grounded in every sense of the word in place and thinking about that. And that claustrophobia of place doubling and tripling. So there's a sense in which you know, one can't help but respond to that. But I also want to make the point that I feel in some ways closer to George in the writing than I do to my native place. And by that I mean there's a way in which the writing, certainly this collaboration, the writing could only take place, could only happen and emerge because there was this will, this interest, this project, this impulse to connect, this impulse to say something to George that would be interesting and fun and you know, speak to our friendship as well as to our mutual vocation. You see what I mean? And that in a sense goes beyond being Singaporean. That has to do with us being poets in the world together. And I think that's important. There is a place for that we don't have a passport for, but perhaps we do, and that passport is the writing. And that passport is undiminished by the plague, as it were.
Well, you know, Theresa May said that if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. Well, here we are. There's Alvin in Singapore. There's Hideko, who's out in Tokyo, and we're all scattered all over the place. And we are citizens of the world in many ways. I mean, what do you think, Lisa? You asked the question.
Yeah.
How do you feel about it?
I think technology has enabled us to kind of transcend our geographies, and you know, not just the technology of travel, air travel. You know, before the pandemic, we all just jumped on a plane in the way that 40 years ago we wouldn't have done. So I agree that we are more. There are more opportunities to be citizens of the world, and I think literature allows you to be a citizen of the world, to read through and beyond the lenses of your own experience.
Very much. Truly, like the spaces is so different nowadays. Like we kind of much closer than we were at some point. And how about George or Alvin? Would you have anything that you kind of like responding from this dialogue?
Well, my question was going to be to actually to all of us really, is we all of us have other places in our minds, in our memories, in our presence. And we have other languages. So we could be writing potentially in our different languages. I'm sure Lisa could, I'm sure Alvin could, may do. But it leaves us at an interesting position in English writing, because essentially we conduct our poetry in English. I happen to live in England, but where is, I was imagining if there was should we have turned out to have been that good and that important, God knows. But if there were to be another Paul Graves Golden Treasury, would that be a place where those of us who are, if you like, not writing from within the roots of this language, where we have a home? I'll just add one little bit of interesting knowledge. There is a Penguin book, or was it Faber? I can't remember now, of English poetry, which included at least one poem by Miroslav Holub, which was really interesting because, of course, Holub was Czech and he didn't write in English. These things that were translated. So in a way, it's a bit like the citizens of the world question, whether our poetry has a place in, or where does it have a place?
So it's one of those things that, of course, has been worked on and sort of expanded and reflected on by writers in the 20th and certainly the 21st century. What George said put me in mind of this anthology. You can't see it on screen, but it's called Language for a New Century, Contemporary Poetry from the Middle East, Asia, and Beyond. A lot of the writing here, I mean, all the writing here is from the traditional Anglophone centers. A lot of it is originally in English. There's a tremendous amount of work in the English language that doesn't come from places one assumes the English language is practiced, quote unquote, natively, whatever that means. A lot of that is, of course, the legacy of colonialism and the Commonwealth and things like that. There is so much stuff going on. We have our hands full trying to document that. George knows, of course, you know, we've met each other over the years in various places, you know, India, China, so many parts of the world where poetry, including poetry in English, is alive and well and thriving. But I think the attention being paid to writing in the language is disproportionate to the amount of really good work that's actually out there and available. And those of us who aren't in the UK or Australia or the US, we find our own ways to sort of mark and celebrate and put out work like that. I'm one of the few who are privileged to have these relations with the UK. I've got a book out in the UK as well as elsewhere. And I do find that there is a different perspective going on. A different relationship to the gatekeepers, perhaps, a different relationship to the glamour of being published, for example, in the UK, because we have different centers to sort of support us, different communities of practice to lean on. And I think at a time like this, where people are sort of obliged, where we've all been obliged to think about what it means for us to work, to live, what is essential to us, who our communities are, who do we care about. A lot of these things have become freshly relevant questions. Look at us. I mean, we're connecting across continents here, and there is a sense in which, you know, we are, for today, a community that we may not necessarily find, you know, in our own cities,
alternate
right?
republic, the alternative republic.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree. I think technology has really enabled a lot of us to move beyond the cultures that we're located in, but beyond the languages that we may speak as our mother tongues. You know, it's really easy now to consciously, if you wish to, use tools to read across languages. That there's this sort of explosion of that enabling to be porous. But English, I think, for me, has always been a porous language. You think about the number of loan words that it's come from, the fact it doesn't have an academy like the French Academy for Language. That's what makes it exciting for me to be the language that I write my poetry in. And I don't believe in English with a capital, you know, English language with a capital E and a capital L. I believe there are Englishes, and they're all very exciting, and it's where they interweave, where the edges of those worlds and those tongues rub against each other. For me, that's where all the excitement is for me in my own writing and in the writing that I read. So I find that really exciting. And
Lisa, can you please come and tell the Singapore government that?
Yeah,
they refuse to believe it.
I know, and then there is this. You talked about gatekeepers. You know, there are gatekeepers in the academy, but there are also gatekeepers in, you know, in political and business senses. But
in terms of English language, the gates are fairly open. They're much more open now than they were 30, 40 years ago. I remember being asked to give a lecture on the Englishness of English verse, which is actually the title of a book. It's by Donald Davy. Actually, the title of the book is The Purity of Diction in English Verse. That is to say that there was some kind of range of possible speech that could be centered. I think what's interesting, and it's a very nice development, is that there are an awful lot of books which are appearing in English now, in England, in Britain now, which are written by people who maybe are just as kind of at the same sort of angle to English as I am. That's to say, we're here, but this is not where we started. Okay, well, I'll start because I suppose was the first poem in it. And the first poem in it, which is not amongst those we read, was one of those 10-line poems, which happened to be in a daily, it is a daily piece of writing that Alvin picked up on. And then, so there was the notion of something along the line of the haiku. I don't mean anything like the classical haiku, but the way that the thought wanders through and can touch on sensory things and things that one thinks about. I have my own kind of various ways of writing, so I quite like using tightly rhymed form. Not for everything, but I think it's a fascinating thing to do. So we moved into that. I think chatted, then Alvin responded, and then we go off, and I go off in Alvin's direction. I think that is the whole essence of collaboration. Just one extra instance, I together with Carol Watts, a very different poet from me, we put a complete book together. And basically, I am constantly writing like Carol. So I'm picking up what Carol was doing, and I'm thinking, okay, I wonder if I can talk this language. And then I sort of get used to it. And I'm glad of it. So I'm very glad in a collaboration for two things. One, to learn something from my fellow poet. So I pick up it's a bit like translation in a way. If you do translation, you are picking up other voices, and you're willy-nilly, you're kind of integrating them into something. It may be wholly unconscious, but that's a good thing. And secondly, when you are working with somebody else, and I said I've always loved that, then there is always something to bounce back from, something which takes you further. So you set out on a course, you don't know what it is. We had no idea. And you begin to, if you like, find these touching points. And you think, okay, I can go from there. Isn't it interesting where that takes me? Because otherwise I might not have thought of going there.
Yeah, so absolutely agree. And I've always seen poetry writing as engaging in conversation. You might be, trying to engage in conversation with someone long past, but in this case, you have the privilege. We had the privilege of being engaged in conversation with each other. We've got the friendship to build on, but also our work was, we were working with each other's what we had said before. And just like in a conversation, you pick up words and you build on them. You reflect the other person that you're speaking with in particular ways, but you're also trying to add your own point of view, pushing against, but also going along with in many ways. So I very quickly picked up on George's sort of haiku form to begin with, partly because I really love his work. And that piece, Diaphanous, that we started with George, just seemed very apt for the times, right? The haiku form with its sense of seasonality and its sense of transience that has always been inherent in the traditional use of the form. He wasn't doing the traditional thing, but it had a lot of that quality to it, or at least that's what I picked up. So I picked it up to play with continuing that spirit. And somewhere along the way, and we talked about this, do we do a whole book of that, or do we see how the writing goes? And we quickly found that after a while, you kind of want to break things. I don't know if it's because, we're perverse people, or I'm a perverse person. After a while, things happen too neatly, and you start to introduce interesting cracks. I think the same goes in music and music theory. They talk about that as well. You start to introduce all kinds of variants, fragments. At one point, it just went completely into prose poetry, for example, and we were then allowing ourselves to play, which I think is such an important part of writing. And it looped back again at some point. And it's that sort of fell and soup of the writing that we agreed to allow, that we agreed to play together. That's the only basis. Yeah.
There's no poetry without diversity. I think it's one of the definitions of poetry. You have to want to break things and to hold things together at the same time. But if they're holding together too tightly, too neatly, perhaps the word isn't exactly tightly, but if they're holding together in a way that becomes predictable, you want to break it. You want to see where else you can go.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was interesting. I remember remarking about this. It was when we were starting to come out of the early lockdowns that the writing also wanted to come out of lockdown, as it were, to start to break away from sort of stricture and form. I'm still thinking about whether it was related, but certainly I think there is a resonance there of being sick and tired of being stuck indoors, as it were, and wanting to push against the walls a little bit. I think there's a question for Lisa in chat. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Maybe I think like Elspeta, she also mentioned a couple of questions relating to your collaborative work. Maybe see if you have anything to add to it. I think she was mentioning about this and how it enacts grammar on our side and
something about you. I think the second person singular or plural, because you will do for both, is the most protean of pronouns, because at one point it addresses a person directly, as in a very intimate love poem, for example. That you is a very clear personal you, and it's a touching distance you. But there are all other ways of using you. I can't remember when I was teaching, Jenny, whether I actually went through any of this, because I was fascinated by the use of pronouns and how you can be used in a perfectly impersonal sort of way. Well, how do you get to Norwich from Wyndham? Well, you turn down the next road, yeah, and then you turn right, and then you turn left, and so sometimes you has this quality of being able to shift from the intimate to, if you like, to something just less intimate. We used to, the French have the vous and the tu, and English used to thou, which we don't use anymore. So it had fairly clear boundaries. Now I think it's just, I think one can write notice one, I didn't even notice I was saying it, but one can write the most intimate poems about oneself by using the second person singular. So there you are, standing in the middle of nowhere. So what do you do? Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm hogging the bit on you, but it is a favorite subject of mine. Back to ground control.
I can't remember exactly how it arrived. I mean, I'm very, very interested in repetition, far more than I am interested in rhyme. Actually, I am really interested in the effect of repetition, and I think when I was very inspired by the idea of what happened in the aftermath of the war and the Botany Club, and after just came back to me again and again. I'm also very interested in my work in kind of brokenness. Alvin was talking about the cracks, but also I'm completely uninterested in purity. So I'm completely uninterested in linguistic purity. I'm completely uninterested in things being clear and whole and tight. I'm not that sort of writer. So repetition for me is probably the primary, if there's one wholeness, that's probably the only wholeness that I ever use as a structuring device in my writing. But that's a really interesting question. I have to go back and think about that a lot more. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
And projecting the future as well. I think, if the question were to be, could one write a kind of historical monologue? Because people have done. Anthony Thwaite, who was my editor for many years, he wrote a book called Victorian Voices, in which he kind of wrote monologues for them. Carol Ann Duffy has done that as well. She's done that in her earlier work particularly. So I think it's possible to do that. The question is how far one inhabits the voices which are placed, if you like, in a time separate from oneself. But I'd be interested to ask Alvin back as to, did you have anything particular in mind, Alvin?
No, it's I've been thinking about this. Obviously, my recent chapbook was Uninterrupted Time. Our collaboration was Past Time. This reading was In Our Time. And I realized that I've just become as interested, maybe not more interested, but as interested in this question of time as in a question of place that used to be perhaps more important to my writing. And I've just been thinking, to us, the writing feels live, feels present, feels something we did last week or are reading right now. But, if it ends up in a book and is read 50, 100 years after we're gone, one hopes, may or may not happen. There's a different relationship the reader will have to the work. The language would be different, have a different implication. The relationship of those words, those poems to time would be different from ours. And I'm just wondering whether that is something we think about or reflect on in our writing process, and if so, how? Yeah, I don't have answers, just questions.
I was thinking about this question, and I don't write in response to specific events, or not that I'm conscious of, but I think I've been thinking a lot about shifts in attitude and in society, in the UK, especially since Brexit, but noticing that those shifts are happening throughout the world, and so I've been noticing when I go back and I look at my work in the last couple of years that I am responding to those social changes. But if somebody said, well, are you writing in response to a incident, I'm not. I've never felt the need to do that. But I do know there are poets. There are lots of poets who feel that they respond to that. But I guess we're not ever diverse from our time, are we? Somebody's always going to read us within that context, in the same way that we get asked, when we were born and that sort of thing.
Well, I don't know whether coronavirus is an incident. It's a long incident. It's been going on for a long, long time. And if we can't, you could, I suppose, make a point of saying, I'm definitely not going to write anything about this. But even if you were to say that, it would still enter your central nervous system. It would still be there. It would simply mean possibly that you wouldn't be writing directly about it. I think another way, if I try to get back to something in what Alvin said, because in a way, the question is partly then, how far can we tell that the language that we use now is going to be fully legible in the sense that it may very well be now. It is possible, and people do use quotations in poetry. It is possible to pick up, I don't know, a line from a 17th century metaphysical or from a 19th century romantic, and you can absorb these things. I mean, we've known this from Eliot from a long time ago. It's what modernism was doing way back, in 1917, 1819, and even possibly before then. So in a way, our engagement with time is permanent, and our meanings, it is the nature of language to wear away. It's because different bits of it get rubbed too hard, and then it wears incredibly thin. And I think that probably happens much more quickly in our time than it probably ever did, because we have the technological means of circulating this language. Not that again, yes? Not that cliche of feeling, not in those words, not in that form. So we are almost permanently aware of time's winged chariot hurrying near and breathing on our necks, because, what seems to be okay now, but you can't tell. You only work by faith. It's all pitch and toss, and what line should I write next? Oh, I'll write this one. I'll use this word because this is the word that seems right at the time.
Yeah.
You can't calculate it. You can't
Yeah.
work it out. I don't think,
Yeah.
it'd be interesting if any poet present, when they write a poem, in line 1, do they know what line 4 is going to be? I don't suppose it's a poem if you do, no.
Yeah. Yeah. They might write like that. I'm not sure I would want to read it. It'd be so calculated.
I was going to say that's the gift of reading, isn't it? It allows us to travel through time and across time, in collapse time, in a way that it's hard when you're the producer of the piece of the work.
It's also interesting. Yeah. So one of the interesting side tracks to this question is the fact that one changes as well. We are not the poet we were 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Even though, you know, those of us who get read for exams or get studied by or have papers written about them, etc., it can feel as if one is suspended. Like, you know, they're still reading and saying Alvin Pang is that kind of poet based on work written 20 years ago. I'm like, no, you know, just completely move past that now. But that moving past doesn't necessarily happen because my relationship to the writing and to time is different from what is received. You know, not that it necessarily should matter to us because we're always just playing with the now, really.
I totally feel very strongly that, like, when you mentioned that, for example, it's very possible to enter all your poems with a sort of a kind of like a more universal, that anyone can respond to it without knowing too much about who you are as a person. But at the same time, you can also read it as quite a personal poem in a way, like responding to the individual point of view. And, you know, the more that we know about you as a poet, that also helps. So it's very interesting how it is possible to read it both ways.
Well, it is fascinating to some degree. In as far as we are persons, we are interested in the voices that are talking to us as though as they are persons. But of course, they're constructed and they're made up, not consciously constructed, but we cannot help but construct ourselves and then deconstruct and then construct and so forth. So we want to form, we have ideas of the poets of the past. I kind of have an idea about Alexander Pope or John Donne or about Keats or about Emily Dickinson. And I think, yeah, Emily, there you are. I recognize your voice. I'd recognize it anywhere. And in fact, we do recognize the voices of many poets. And just as, you know, people may well say, oh, well, I'm sure that's an Alvin Pang poem. I'd know it anywhere. And then they would adduce a whole series of whatever reasons they have and say it's there. Of course, when you're alive and you are still Alvin Pang, then you don't want to be, then it feels very constricting to be, if you like, to be trapped within the voice that you're assigned.
Yeah.
I'm interested in my work being open enough so that the reader is the one who chooses where the full stop is. And going back to Alvin's point about being, you know, having somebody else select, if I think about the writers that I read, every one of those, the bit that I retain, I've selected it. And that makes my relationship with that writer and that body of work specific to me. And I think for me, the reader is the co-collaborator in everything that I do. The reader is the person who finishes the work, and they finish the work when they read it for themselves and they choose or not to make it part of their life. And I find that incredibly exciting about reading other people's work and knowing that when I am blessed that other people read my work, you know, I find that really exciting.
But of any writer, anybody undertaking an artistic kind of venture, that they are not in a position of self-definition, unless you're a high ironist who sort of makes a great point of publishing a series of self-definitions in a slightly ironic sort of way.
I don't read any Korean. But I absolutely love this translation. It gave me a whole new worldview, and the images are startling and incredibly powerful. But I've also just recently read this book by Linda France, and I found that really, really good as well.
So I'm George.
After you, Alvin. After you.
Okay. So I'm gonna remove my background so you can see, because it's really awkward sharing. Now I can share books. I'm just gonna blurb a few books now. I just received this collection, second collection by Linda Ashok, young Indian poet that George also knows. And she just came up with this collection called Waiting for the Helicopter that I think has some really startling imagery in there. She likes to pull language sideways, as it were. That just arrived, and I've read some of it. It's good. There is, for those of you who are interested in eco-writing, a new book coming out of Singapore. Some young people put together a collection of essays called Eating Chili Crab in the Anthropocene. And I think there are some really good fresh takes. I mean, we get a lot of writing about the Anthropocene and ecological issues coming from the West, as it were. There are relatively few works like that coming out from Asia, Southeast Asia, which is, of course, even with COVID, the fastest growing parts of the world. And thinking about this in Asia, I think, is going to be quite definitive for climate change issues. So it's good to know what young people are thinking. And this came out of my PhD work. After I finished my PhD, I just kind of wanted to not read for a long time. But I couldn't stop myself from reading The Stop by David Applebaum. And it is a book about philosophy and about writing. And there is something in there that's quite beautiful about how blindness isn't necessarily a disability, but there is something about the groping nature of the blind person finding their way in the dark that is in some ways resonant with the creative process. And that's something that helped me cope, really, and something I'm still thinking about. So that's it from me.
Thank
George.
you.
Well, at the moment, I'm on a jury of a book prize. So I'm reading a novel about a per day or a per day and a half. But in terms of poetry, I've got about 4 books here, which I think are all very good and interesting. This is Maria Ferenczuhova. It's called Tidal Events, Selected Poems. It's from the Slovakian. I get quite a lot of books of translation, and I thought she was, she's within the European modernist tradition, but what she does with it, she deals both with kind of nature and with loneliness, and she deals with these things very beautifully. Carolyn Forshay, who's a very well-known poet, this is her latest book, In the Lateness of the World. Carolyn Forshay has got a long association with travel, but she spent some of her youth in El Salvador at the time of the Civil War, or just preceding the Civil War, which has given her a very great kind of passion and involvement with places that are lost or people that are lost. And she's got a highly sensuous, sensory kind of vocabulary. I think it's a very, very fine book. This by Ian Seed, called The Underground Cabaret, is entirely prose poems, but they're prose poems which kind of delight me because they actually contain rather straight-faced narratives, which don't do any fancy sort of surrealist tricks, but they just kind of lead you somewhere and leave you there. And where they leave you is always somewhere intriguing. I thought there are a number of very, very good prose poets around, and I think he's a particularly good one who I've just noticed. Now, one more, and this is a very unexpected one, and this is called Mock Orange, and it's by a poet called Anne Osborne, who's basically a plant biologist. And what her aim for a very long time has been to try to bring together the topos of science, but also of poetry. And she does so, I think, in this book. She's been trying to do it for a long time, but this is the first book. And she does it by a fascinating mixture of sort of precise scientific terminology, but also great kind of familial intimacy. And there are poems about her mother and her father, and about the experience of both being a scientist. There's a poem about dissecting a dogfish, which is something I myself did when I was at school. And the dogfish, I think, is called something like Sid. But it's a dogfish, and you're dissecting it. And she's trying to balance these states of response in which you are both have a direct living relationship to something, but at the same time, and a lot of poems about Linnaeus, the great classifier. So I thought that was a rather fascinating book, and not a book I would have expected normally to come across, but I'm very pleasantly surprised by.